Welcome back, grade 5 to 8. I hope you had 100% germination. By the time we see you guys again, we may be as in awe of how much you've grown as you are in awe of your bean growth. A lot of changes happen to our bean plants around the 1 week mark, so hopefully you have lots of room to take down observations. We're also going to do some transplanting this week, so you may have to scrounge around for some soil and a few receptacles to put each bean sprout in. Today we are on day 6. 6 days since we first put the bean seeds into water. We should back up a little bit because on day 5, I noticed that the beans were getting green. Whenever we see green in a plant, it means that the plant is starting to make its own food using sunlight. Now, these beans still have a food source, the cotyledons, and all of the beans' cotyledons are still very much similar, except for the fact that the cotyledons themselves are now turning green. The cotyledons are not designed to be great at making food. The leaves are, but the leaves are just starting to break through, and we will see them in a couple of days. So the order in which the plant grows is first the roots, the stems are getting longer, and then the leaves are the last thing to appear once the plant is ready to do some serious growing. The seed that we marked out with the 1 millimeter markings we need to get it onto the root because we're starting to block the cotyledon, the leaf, from getting out of the cotyledon. If we look closely at the markings themselves have begun to get wider. The original markings were less than 1 millimeter long. Now they're almost double in size. One thing that is of interesting note is that the very tip of the original root has shriveled up, and I recall that when I was marking it that I was actually piercing inside the root, so the ink itself, the root didn't like the ink that I put on it, and in its place you notice that root offshoots have come from the side of the main root. The original root we generally call the tap root, and any of the roots that come from the side are what we call fibrous roots. And different plants optimize or emphasize the tap root, and other plants emphasize fibrous roots, depending on the amount of moisture it needs or the particular nutrients it needs from the soil. We will continue to monitor our roots until we begin to plant them into soil to see what kind of roots these bean seeds prefer. As it stands, these beans are just trying to get water, and once the main tap root of this seed was damaged, it spread out in all directions with several fibrous roots spreading out around in a flat manner, because it was up against the flat surface of the paper towel. If it was able to get water in all directions, the fibrous roots would probably spread out in all directions. Now that I've arranged the elastic band on top of the root and not covering up the cotyledons, each of these bean plants over the next couple of days is going to turn upward. The cotyledon is going to flip up, and as it does so, it's going to open up and show us the new leaves. By now, we should think about, if we haven't been doing already, putting these beans in some more direct sunlight. These beans did not get sunlight until the first probably 4 days, and then they were moved to the windowsill. Putting them in sunlight will only accelerate the growth at this point. While sun was not needed in the beginning, only water was. Is actually a good term to describe the order that plants need things. The first thing they need is water. They need air. Then they need sunlight. And lastly, they need soil to get the nutrients that they can't get from the water, the air, and the sunlight. And the soil will be the last thing that we put in, hopefully sometime within the next week. And for day 6, the leaves are visible. Today is day 7 since we first put the bean seeds in water. And with day 7, this 1 week timeline that has gone by, we have an important benchmark. The leaves, as you can see, are hatching. They are breaking out through the cotyledons and will soon be unfurled. The leaves are exposed. And one important thing to note about the leaves is that they are more green than the rest of the plant. And that is related to the fact that leaves specialize in making food for the plant. There's already food stored in the cotyledons, and the outside of the cotyledons are green, but the leaves are even more green. It means that the leaves have more chlorophyll than the rest of the plant. Chlorophyll is the pigment which absorbs all light except green. We see green because the other colors are being absorbed. The process of photosynthesis is the plant taking light, sunlight, or any other available light, and using it to make food. The leaves initiate that process of food making, and therefore they have more green and are more densely green with chlorophyll than the rest of the plant. The leaves over the next few days are also going to unfurl. They're going to open up and then turn upside down, which essentially means that they'll be right side up. What we see now is actually the underside of the leaves, and you can tell by looking at the veins that are much more thick from the underside of the leaf than once it gets flipped over. So right now the leaves are upside down, and when they are unfurled, they are going to flip right side up. And what's more, the top of the leaves will be even more green than the underside of the leaves. Why would the top of the leaves be more green? Because they are getting more sunlight and light in general than the bottom of the leaves. Today is day 8, and in the last 24 hours, we have seen the stems of these bean sprouts shoot up quite a bit, in some cases several centimeters. Now, the stem from leaf to cotyledon, in some cases 3 centimeters just in the last 24 hours. The leaves have clearly distinguished themselves from the rest of the plant, though not quite opening up yet. Even though they aren't opening up, the sprouts, if they're kept in the light, are beginning to move toward the light. These plants, if they are left in a windowsill, they will start to grow toward the light, even though the leaves have not completely unfurled yet. The reaching of the plant and the growth toward the light is one of the ways that plants move. They don't have the same type of characteristic locomotion that animals do, but plants move in a way that helps them to adapt to the conditions, even though they are rooted to the ground. So day 8 has one other feature. Now that the leaves have distinguished themselves from the plant, they are going to begin making food at a much faster rate. And as they do so, they are using up the remaining food in the cotyledons. The cotyledons, in fact, the taller the plant, the more the cotyledons are beginning to shrivel up. They're actually getting a little bit brown and shriveled. They are getting used up. The food stored in them is being used by the plant, and that is the transitional phase between the plant using its own stored food to making its own food from the leaves. And the amount that the cotyledons are shriveled up is directly related to how tall the bean plant is. The ones that have not grown as much have still more rounded cotyledons, but the ones that have shot up the most have more shriveled up cotyledons. So day 8 has cotyledons shriveling up. It's also the day that we're going to start planting these. Now remember our WAS acronym: water, air, sunlight, and soil. We are now on the final phase to get these plants up to speed. Although we're not going to plant all of them, we want to experiment and see just when and how the soil affects the plants. The only way to test that is to not put all of the sprouts into soil. So we're going to put most of them in, but we're going to leave 2 of the sprouts where they are to see how long they can last without soil and what kind of effects not being in moist soil will have. If you have a couple of small planting pots left over from a previous Mary Mother of God planting exercise, those would work very well. Notice these have a hole in the bottom, which means you'll need to have a container underneath them so the water, when it leaks out, does not make a mess. If you don't have soil in them and you're going to put soil in them, the easiest thing to do is to put the bean sprout in the pot and then put some soil around it. You're less likely to damage the root that way. So I'm going to take off the tallest sprout delicately. I'm going to place it in the plant, the planter. And then I'm going to put some soil around it. And then I'm going to add some water to it. The soil that I'm using is quite dry, so it will take some time to absorb the water, and that's okay. Now I'm going to take a second bean sprout. And put some soil around it. And we're going to give it some water. I'm going to leave 2 of the sprouts in here. I'm going to pick the smallest one and one of the larger ones, and that way it's easier to compare. If the smaller one takes more time to feel the effects of not having soil compared to one of the larger ones, and I'll plant the other 2. So just to recap our experiment, we have 2 sprouts in soil on the windowsill, 2 sprouts remaining in water on the windowsill, and then the last 2 sprouts are in soil but out of the direct sunlight, maybe somewhere on the table or another place in the room where it's not going to hit directly, just with the lights that you have on in your house and the other indirect light coming from outside. This will allow us to test 2 different variables at once: how sunlight affects the growth of bean sprouts and how soil affects the growth of bean sprouts. We're going to try and control the amount of water that each of these sprouts is getting, so make sure that they're all staying moist, both in the soil and in the original glass with paper towel. It doesn't mean you have to water them every day, but you do need to check in on them every day to make sure that all of the roots and soil are remaining moist. That's all for this week, bean growers. Make sure to keep your roots moist, but don't speak too moistly.